This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Hello everyone, my name is Kądzielska-Koper and this is Common Sense Generation, a platform for free thoughts, philosophical thoughts. We talk about community, values and philosophy. With me in the studio is Professor David Engels, a historian and a philosopher in two. David, thank you very much for coming.
Sure, thank you very much for the invitation. Looking forward a lot to our discussion.
Well, this is an international platform and you are, let's say, very much international because from Belgium, you come from Belgium, you have two mother tongues, which is French and German, which is extremely interesting. And somehow you made your academic journey here to Poland because currently you are an associated research professor at Instytut Zachodni in Poznań, Poland. But you come from Brussels, as I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So my journey has been all then straightforward. So I'm from Belgium. I'm from this tiny German-speaking community in the east of Belgium, where people are basically bilingual. So I grew up with German and French as the main languages. I did my studies in Germany, in Aachen, so I did my PhD there, my also my associate professorship, and then I became a full professor in Brussels at the Université Libre de Bruxelles in 2008, and then I remained there for 10 years until I shifted to Poland. And that move has been quite unusual from a certain point of view, because usually people rather tend to go from Poland to elsewhere than from elsewhere to Poland, at least.
Exactly, that's the traditional way of doing it.
Exactly.
But you, with both of those languages, which is also a form of, it gives you a platform to exist in, at least in the world of German speakers, which are at least 3 countries, and the world of French speakers, which is sort of, I would say, a love-hate relationship. I don't know how you manage this in your own head.
There are huge differences, of course, when it comes to mentality.
Does your German identity and your French identity quarrel with each other in your heart?
There are indeed some difference between both, but I would say that you see, I don't really feel German, but I wouldn't feel French also. So when I'm in Germany, I feel like a stranger, but if I'm in France also, I feel like a stranger. So somehow you could guess that I'm Belgian, but unfortunately there isn't really a Belgian mentality also. There's a certain tendency, of course, that Belgians tend to be more easy to compromise with, for example, than the Germans or the French, who are very often very assertive, whereas the Belgian people are, let's say, a little bit more reserved and tend to not to make a bit fuss, so that might be perhaps some form of identity. But yeah, there's a huge difference, and it's not always easy to combine them. Even more so now, as I'm slowly learning. Not very well Polish, but at least about Polish mentality. I'm trying also to fit that in somehow in how to function on a public level. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to learn about European mentalities.
So tell me, please, how did it happen that you actually chose Poland to live in?
Yeah, well, the origin was, of course, a book I published in 2013 on the similarities between today's crisis of Europe and the crisis and downfall of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. So not the fall of the Roman Empire, but the fall of the Roman Republic, the civil wars, the slow transformation into a more authoritarian system. And with that book, I became frequently asked to getting involved into let's say public political writing about the European Union, about European identity and so forth. And so my activities shifted more and more from classical academia towards more work on political subjects. And so when basically in 2018, I had this opportunity of doing that full time. That seemed very interesting for me on a professional level. And on the other side, there was, of course, also the private level that, the Belgium, Western Europe is in this deep identity crisis with the downfall of the family, of Christianity, mass migration, wokeism, all that kind of stuff. And Poland at that moment, at least, seemed to be a bit more protected and to be a better place somehow to have my kids growing up and to be in a safe environment where we didn't have to confront them to all these issues. Of course, now with the elections in Poland, this is shifting in a very quick way again, unfortunately.
But of course, I mean, the society is somehow different. I would say with me, for example, a student studying in Berlin, I realized that what is very left-wing here in Poland is still at least the center or right-wing in Germany. It was, this even sort of aesthetic difference is very much there. So I would say the society, even here when they think they are left-wing, they're usually very center, let's say, for what we experience further in Europe.
There is that, of course, and you are right. There's still a huge difference to Germany, but still, even in this 5 years and a half, I'm now here in Poland. I have this impression of a certain acceleration of the, let's say, westernization, but in a negative way. You see, so that the downfall of the church, the also the demographic decline, the mentality when it comes to how to see one's own identity, European identity, LGBT stuff, and so on. So there is some form of and the influence, of course, of social media, of TikTok, of Netflix. I saw all that also very strongly on my students here in Poland, and sometimes I'm saying that I have this impression of living what happened in Belgium since 1990 and 2020 now here in acceleration.
Wow! So you relive like sort of
déjà vu.
Déjà vu.
Unfortunately,
that's scary to hear.
It's a bit,
Probably. I do hope that there are at least some platforms of common sense. That's what we are doing here right now. Exactly. There's this element of common sense, and I do think that the common sense can be found in the right, but in the left as well. Because after all, not everyone is absolutely crazy. I do hope so, at least.
Yeah, many people are often, I think, very well intentioned. That is somehow, of course, also on the left. So I think that is, of course, also part of this crisis, that you can't just say one side is bad, the other is good. So I think there are many well-intended people on the left, and I guess there are also many not really frequentable people on the right. But that makes it so difficult, of course, to be in a debate and to
be in a political debate, especially when you are a academic.
Yeah, exactly.
And you are a historian originally, and you do something very, very interesting called you try to write a comparative history of different civilizations and try to make it possible. Tell us a little bit more. What do you mean by this? Because as we both agree probably that it is impossible to write a universal history of all the whole mankind, because let's say Polish history would be very different than the Russian history, but a British history is very different than a French history. And right now, I would say we all live in a time when the narrative is mostly written by US. We live in American narrative and American history. But if this clash of civilization between China and America wins over China, then we all will have a very different Chinese perspective, and we all probably going to speak Putonghua, which is Mandarin.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at least for food, that would probably be a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. Chinese food is
Chinese
amazing.
hegemony, I think that is at least one of the things that would be a definite improvement in comparison to the American culinary hegemony. But yeah, there were a lot of questions in that. So, I mean, already when I started my studies of history, when I was 18 years old, I did it with the perspective of world history. So I was never only interested in Roman history or European history. It was always the entirety of history that was interesting to me, and especially from a comparative point of view. I've been very strongly influenced by Oswald Spengler and all this school of thought that is trying to show how the major civilizations develop in a roughly comparative and parallel way. Of course, there's not only Spengler, there's also Toynbee, partly even Hegel. So I mean, this idea that civilizations can be compared and behave or develop in a comparative and parallel fashion goes, of course, already back to classical antiquity. So there's nothing new in there. But that was really what amazed me most. And since then, basically, since I'm 18, I'm writing, rewriting, adding, changing this comparative history I'm doing. And so, for example, the book I mentioned on the path towards empire, on the parallels between today and the late Roman Republic, is just, let's say, one very small excerpt, you could say, out of that major idea. And yes, I'm convinced that there are things like civilizations, that there is something like a European civilization, a Chinese civilization, an Indian civilization, a Muslim civilization. They have their own identity, they have their own very specific outlook on life. You can't really just translate one into the other without losing a lot. As you see from China, of course, the mentality is very different, but also very unique. It gives you a lot of new perspectives on life, on transcendence, on nature. So there's a lot to learn from that. And I believe still that that we as European nations, of course, have much more in common than we have with other civilization, which is, of course, quite logical. I mean, you said that English history and French history are very different, and the mentalities are still very different. But of course, they are still much nearer to each other than if you compare them to someone from the Indian civilization. So I think it is possible to outline the broad tendencies in the history of a civilization, and that is basically what I'm doing. And so in my project, the Western civilization is just one tiny part of it all, basically.
And you put in the Western civilization at the European country and the American.
Yeah, and of course, there's not only that. There's of course also the question of Australia, South Africa in part. Then there's the open question: can we fit in? Of course, Latin America, which is obviously very strongly influenced by European civilization. So I would say that this European civilization is indeed in Europe, in the Americas, Australia, as part of South Africa. I think that is the main. Their main geographical outline.
And right now, when it's collapsing with its identity and you're sort of fleeing from it, from Belgium here to Poland, how do you see this in this perspective that do you think that there is still a very strong core which will keep us all together despite the changes, despite the fact that at least half of the society sort of hates the background of our civilization and sees it and combines it with, white supremacy and slavery and hates ourselves, let's say. But on the other hand, in the same moment, they are not part of the Black society or part of the Chinese society. I haven't seen myself Chinese people who hate being Chinese. There's this very European part of our identity, or Western, because probably it happened in US as well.
Exactly. I think there are two main points. On the one hand, this form of lethargy, of post-historical disinterest in our own civilization, partly even the hate of one civilization, and this embracing of some form of abstract universalist multiculturalism. That's not new, of course. That is a typical symptom of every late civilization. So if we look at the late Greco-Roman society, that we can see most of the indicators of crisis, also of the identity crisis, already there. So this self-dismantling of the West, this self-destruction now in the West is typical for all late civilizations. So it's not absolutely new. And on the other hand, the form in which this is happening is, exactly as you said, typically Western. This form of, let's say, absolutely nearly arrogant, self-despising. This idea that now we have learned from our history, and now we have to teach all the others, even if necessary by force, to become like us and to take the same lessons. That is, of course, colonialism, just the other way around, basically. So there is some form of perversion of the initial ideals of the Western civilization. I mean, our Western civilization is based on Christianity, and of course, in Christianity, we have this idea of the original sin, that is now perverted nowadays as well. The old white man, and this idea that our civilization is sinful and has so much to atone for it. This is just some form of perverted form of Christianity.
You would say, okay, so it's a form of a religious point of view, but taken away without transcendence. Okay, but looking at the scapegoat.
Exactly, and so also this idea that we have to save humanity. Now we have to save the planet, for example.
Yes.
So that the equality of everyone, but of course in Christianity it's essentially the equality of everyone before God. Now it's the equality of everyone in the face of climate or of the United Nations or something like that. So you can take nearly all the major points of classical Western Christianity, you take God away, you put a lot of self-hate in it, and then you have today's world.
And this is scary and informal because it's, of course, blocking us from development and taking away sort of this raison d'être, because you have to somehow believe in yourself and what you're doing that is originally good as well, in order to be successful in what you're doing. If you hate yourself all the time and every building and the culture which is made us where we are, then that you're not going very far, unfortunately, which is scary, because this element of right now, when I think that our world, especially when we see in this part of Eastern Europe, then that it has ended somehow with the aggression of Russia over Ukraine, I would say at least, that and we have a lot of people who come to Europe suddenly with a totally different point of view, and they haven't yet been that well fed as it's part of Western Europe, let's say, and they are a part of I don't know if you say something about Russian civilization, but there is definitely this problem with Russia, which is a unique form, and it influences part of neighboring countries with, I would say, a different way of life, which is what we at least experience. Is this first of all, there's much less freedom, of course. And there is this apathia which you live in, and this grayness which previously was also in Poland. Right now we took it away, but it's still definitely in Ukraine. It's still definitely it's still definitely in Georgia, and still definitely in neighboring countries which are under right now the Russian influence still. And how do you classify? Because it's threatening, of course, Europe, and we see it, and it's. Also, it comes with certain mentality of people from Ukraine who will live in Europe right now, and we have to sort of know about it. I'm not saying in a bad or good way, but we have to count it that it's going to be here as well. This is Common Sense Generation. If you like this channel, please subscribe, share, and comment. Your voice really matters. How do you, as a historian, but also a philosopher, how do you see Russia?
Mm-hmm. That's an important question where I diverge, at least in parts, from many of my conservative colleagues from Western Europe. Because, as you know, in Western Europe, there's this Russophilia that sees Russia as the hope of Christian values and of patriotism and so forth, and that hopes that Putin somehow will save Western conservatism from evil, woke ideologies. And there are many people believing that. In France, I would say that in France, probably 90% of the conservatives, of the right-wing conservatives, are pro-Russian, and I
Which
think
is crazy.
In Germany it must not be so difficult, so different. My own approach is a bit different, but it is also based on Spengler, who already believed, as do most Russians themselves, that Russia is a proper civilization, that Russia is not part of the European civilization, that it is its own world, that it functions on its own mentality, its own psychology, that it has its own logic somehow, and that Russia is essentially conserved and interested in itself, of course, in building its empire. Russia has a totally different political and geographical logic from the Western one. We are divided now in small, tiny nation states that have their very divergent identity, whereas Russia is not a state. Russia is not a nation state. Russia is a world in its own somehow, and so its concept, of course, is that of the Russian Mir, that is of this imperial ideology that fits it all together, that is authoritarian, but that at the same time also gives its inhabitants some form of pride, of strength to survive this grayness of their everyday. So that their existence. So there's a huge difference, a huge gap between both, which is why I think that this idea that so many French conservatives have, that Russia is going to save European conservative, is, from my point of view, absolutely naive, because the Russians, of course, for the moment, are sending signals that they are against wokeism, that they are for the nation state, the family, Christianity. But should Europe one day indeed become a conservative, strong empire, let's say, then Russia would probably the first that would try to give a lot of money to leftist powers in Europe in order to fragment Europe once again. Russia's interest is in a fragmented Europe, so that Russia itself can thrive. So that is, of course, a very different goal from that which Europe should have, at least, but which doesn't have.
Well, for people who were sort of born in this part of Europe, which is Poland, even Ukraine, Latvia, Latva, then that we, of course, it is obvious because we have experienced, or at least saw, what is really the Russian mentality, and we see it right now very harshly with everything what's happening in Ukraine, and with the cruelty, which is only to compare it to the cruelty of World War II, which just suddenly happened just next to the border of Poland, and I do see it as if a Polish border is sort of the wall right now of between the grayness of this world and the brutality of the Western civilization to the Western civilization, which is scary. I'm not sure if people in France or Italy, they really realize what would it be if the Russian soldiers come closer.
They don't realize. I can say also from my own perspective, as having grown up in Belgium, that for most people in France and in Belgium, already Poland is far, far, far away in another galaxy. Nearly nobody has ever been to Poland. Most Germans have never been to Poland, even though it's their immediate neighbor, perhaps once to buy some cigarettes or to fuel their cars, for example. But most have never been in Poland. So for them, already Poland is totally unknown. And Russia is just somewhere on the other side of the world. So they're not interested in that. There's an incredible self-centered vision, especially in France, but also in Germany, that somehow excludes Eastern Europe as being, Eastern Central Europe as being not that interesting somehow. And of course, the Russians did a great job with Russia Today. They managed somehow to create this sympathy. They tried to tie back also that to the admiration of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Rachmaninoff and Pushkin and whatever. So they could use that to create some sympathy. And now it is working very well. And unfortunately, I have to say, this is something that the Polish government until now has largely missed this opportunity in creating sympathy, presenting their own point of view. And so that is why in France, everyone could name immediately 20 big Russian authors or composers, but apart from Chopin, probably nothing that is related to Poland. And that's a tragedy, of course.
And this is a tragedy in many ways. And also what you mentioned, the fact that people in the Western world, in Europe, but in America as well, they romanticize Russia. They see them for the ballet or great authors, as you mentioned, Pushkin or Dostoevsky, but they don't see the reality of everyday life in Russia, which is as brutal as the camps where right now Navalny was murdered. So and I do hope that at least for such sort of platforms as Common Sense Generation and this video post got at least some intellectuals out there in the Western world, they will see. But you, as an intellectual from Belgium, as a person who could just thrive in this way of thinking, what would woke you up? Like, what was if you could say for others to follow your steps, what broadened your horizons that you said, okay, there is something different here, and I want to understand it. I'm not afraid of it.
Yeah, well, I think it was my first visit to Poland in 2017. I think already that enthused me a lot about this country, about let's say the normalcy. I would say that of course there are many things awry in Poland, and it's not an ideal country. There are no ideal countries, but it is a normal country, whereas Western Europe has ceased to be composed of normal countries. And so I found in Poland a lot of the feelings I had when I was a child in Belgium. This kind of normality of seeing more or less correctly dressed European people that seem to belong to some form of middle class in a reasonably cultured way, in streets that are reasonably well kept, and to see that shops are opening and not closing down, and that there's still a very small, nearly inexistent part of, let's say, of Muslim or African migration. All that kind of stuff, I knew it from Belgium in the 80s. That was how I saw my life. And that has changed so quickly in Belgium and is still existent here in Poland. And so every time, especially in the first years, when I returned to Belgium or to Germany, of course, then I was always shocked in remembering what I'd left, because you can become very quickly used to that form of mentality and of normality. And I think many Poles themselves are not aware about the chance they have indeed of having conserved this form of normality. It could give Poland an enormous head start for its own development, and that is why I'm often also so tired, because I'm for 5 years now I'm trying to explain that to my audience, to my lectureship, and so trying to give them this comparison. So I'm trying to say them, use this chance, don't destroy your own country by repeating precisely the same errors that the West did. And so that is why it's even more, let's say, sometimes tiring to see, well, no, the same is happening. Right now, for example, today I published an interview on the idea of a reform of the Polish school system. And already the idea of abolishing homework, of diminishing the number of hours, of diminishing the course material, of more or less of massively diminishing religious teaching, and of scrapping learning knowledge and rather starting to discuss and to pose critical questions. I have seen all that 20 years ago in Belgium. It led the Belgian school system to a total disaster and to failure, whereas the Polish school system is working quite well. If you compare the PISA studies, you see that Poland is on top, is much better quoted than France, Germany, or Belgium when it comes to mathematics, the understanding of language, basic knowledge. Poland is much better off. And now when I see the new government is repeating exactly the same errors, gives me this impression, no, not again. Why do I have to see the same errors once again?
This is, of course, crazy to hear, and I do hope that at least some of them, the ways the people will come to common sense, and the teachers will come to common sense and say that at least some homeworks and learning languages which still exist in Poland. And we are at least not that proud that we think that the whole world will speak Polish. And the other thing is that English is still not enough to be as the only second language. It is worth, and it is important to understand the mentality. Because when you speak an language, then you live in another world, and you have to know it as a German speaker, as a French speaker. That is two different worlds which you are able to live in, and when you deprive young people, students, and teenagers from having this experience and from living and experiencing reading, say Balzac in French, and Hegel in German, then they realize that when they give up all of this, then they give up different worlds. And I do think that at least in some schools, top schools in Poland, it still exists, and I do hope it will thrive in this way and go forward. So but you looking just well, we have to wrap up our interview. But you, as an academic, as someone, because this, I do hope that we have a lot of students who are watching us as well. As a professor, someone who experienced academia in Belgium, in Germany, but also in France, because you are as a professor teaching there, and of course there is this eagerness in young students to be extremely left-wing and to give up any form of conservatism or traditional academia. Why not to do it? What is the value of not, let's say, not devouring every form of idea, but accepting at least some of this?
That's a big question to know why are people giving up conservatism, or why are they giving up, let's say, the interest in their own past. I mean, on the one hand, I could just easily say, well, that's what's happening in every late civilization. People are becoming tired. There's too much to learn. The weight of history is just too cumbersome. It's so easier to say, well, I'm not interested in just leading my life, consuming some stuff, and not interesting anymore. So
we are late Romans right now.
From the late Republic. Yeah, we are a little bit like in the 1st century BC. I would say you can see exactly the same symptoms at that moment. So that is one factor. But the other, of course, is also a moral factor. With the decline of Christianity, with the systematic destruction of Christianity through the media, through the politics and so forth in Western Europe, the main core of our identity has been destroyed. And I'm more and more convinced during these last years that conservatism is not just conserving things from the past for their own sake. I mean, by now, would we want to conserve the 1968 revolution? I don't think so, for example. So I think our conservatism must go back much further, or rather concern the entirety of our history. And I think that we need to say that conservatism means finally tying back our existence, our society, to transcendence. I think that is the only definition that really works. Just saying conservatism means, liking your history and wanting to conserve stuff from the last generation or so. And it doesn't work anymore because there is not much to conserve from the last 50 years. So the only thing how you could really define conservatism is believing in transcendence, believing that there is something higher than our existence, that we partake in this existence, that the aim of our existence is not here but elsewhere. and that so all these ideals of a utopian ideal social state is already typically leftist and is typically materialist. As conservatives, we would have a totally different approach towards society, and I would say that for many centuries it was precisely that divide between materialists and transcendentalists that were the main, let's say, divide of our history. And I think we need to go there back again and realize that only those elements are worth conserving from our history that transport that endeavor of believing in transcendence and defining our existence here through transcendence. For me, that's the only way to do it properly.
And we put a point here. And this was Professor David Engels in Common Sense Generation. And thank you very much for watching this. Please share, like it, and comment, especially if you have a different point of view. And we also thank Polish National Foundation for making this show possible. Well, stay tuned. This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense.